Hello and welcome to Collapse Club, where our topic is how are we to live in the time of collapse? I'm David Baum in Seattle, and with me today is Alexandra Derwen from Northern Wales. Hello, Alexandra.
Hi there.
Today's topic is grief, and grief in the context of collapse acceptance. Alexandra, could you briefly describe your background and your experience so that we know why you know about grief?
If I do at all. Yeah, I can. Thank you, David. My work in the world at an initial first tier of interrogation looks like I'm a death doula. I'm a death doula trainer, and I've also written a couple of books now. Um, I don't know if you're still here. Have you dropped out, David?
No, I'm still here. We're just,
Okay, the screen has filled, so it's just my face that I'm talking to,
yeah.
and that's okay. Don't worry, as long as I know that you're right, you're right there. Hi.
Ah,
Yes, I'll start again. So I'm a death doula and a death doula trainer. I have a social enterprise, which is, I suppose, a not-for-profit, I suppose, in American language. That is a training school, an experiential space for death, dying, and grief. And so the word doula, difficult one really for a lot of people, but it's more about a role that's emerged in the last 60 years or so. That is because of this collapse that we're talking about. The need for doulas emerged, and then almost in a sense complete a full circle return to something quite ancient, as well as being a modern role. So the word's difficult, the concept's difficult for people, but I just keep doing what I do, which is to prepare people to be death doulas and within that grief doulas. And then during the pandemic, when we first met, I wrote my first book, which was called Lost Rites, play on words of last rites, obviously. And the first one was Ceremony and Ritual for Death and Dying, which really looked at the personal journey around death and loss. Moving through the course of that book, it moved more into the communal experience of memorials and communal grieving, which people were saying to me, we need more of this. I need to understand this better. So the second book was Lost Rites, Community of Grief. So really examining our existing communal mourning, but also what could be possible. And then I've just completed writing the third book. So we moved from the personal to the collective into the systemic. So the third book is The Lost Rites of the Ancestral Landscape. And so personal, collective, systemic. And interestingly, I've literally just finished writing that book. That comes full circle back around to the importance of death rites, really. And so there's acres of content just in what I've just said. But somewhere along the line, yes, I got myself a little name in the world as somebody who works with grief. And
very, very
I don't know
good.
if I don't know if anyone can proclaim to be an expert, but that's so that, if you're talking about grief in times of collapse, would be why I'm here.
Great. And thank you for being here.
Yeah.
Uh, we had the chance to talk a couple of years ago now, and I know you have a complete cosmology of um, collapse and connection to the land and a variety of very powerful ideas. For now, though, I'd like to concentrate on just the one question that I have and see if you can throw light on it.
Yeah.
Lately, I have been involved with an idea called collapse acceptance,
Mm.
meaning that instead of dwelling in collapse awareness where all the news is coming, the bad news comes in, and temperatures going up and gases are filling the atmosphere and ice is melting and forests are dying and species are going extinct. You know the litany of
Yeah.
bad news.
Mhm.
That really stresses a person out and forces them to sort of examine their place in the universe. When they do examine that place, they begin to grieve the loss of what that we're looking at, losing the entire world, really.
Mm.
The question is, or my belief is, my belief is there is a transformation that occurs when one really goes deep into that process, and one's concept of one's self really changes, and that the sort of instant, constant misery can be soothed and ameliorated by moving into a different place, a place of collapse, acceptance. But the question has come up in the community: if you accept collapse, are you still grieving? Do you get over your grief? Is it something you do and then you're done? Or is it a continual process? What are your thoughts?
Oh, there I've got so much to say. So I tell you what, I give you permission to interrupt me if you think this has gone on for a long time. So, and I explained to you earlier, didn't I, about my dogs being on the bed with me. So if anyone can hear noises in the background, it's not me. Just need to say, stop it, stop it, stop. Thank you. So acceptance rules out grief. Acceptance is when grieving stops. Acceptance does not include grief. Grief is a temporary thing that passes. All of these things, I'm not sure that they're in alignment with my worldview or my experience of grief. But that, just because what do I know? there may be a state that people can get to, which is beyond grief. I've just never been there. And is grief the same thing as misery? Not in my experience. So there's a couple of key things that rise. First of all, I would distinguish between bereavement and grief. So for me, when the psyche, which is another, I use the word psyche and soul quite interchangeably because it depends on people's worldview, but I'll use psyche, but it could be soul. So when the psyche experiences loss, it takes a while for the full being to process that loss. So and I'll just use actual death as an example. When somebody's been married to someone for 50 years and then that person dies, especially if they die suddenly, there's going to be a period of time where you still hear their footsteps, you still expect them to walk through the door, you still lay the table for them and then go, oh, I forgot they're dead. There's still a feeling of longing and reaching out to their side of the bed. There's this, so the psyche is not adjusted to the reality, this new reality, which is that this person is no longer physically in your life. And I would suggest that bereavement is the period of time that it takes for the psyche to adjust to loss, during which time grief comes to the fore. So we very much associate bereavement and grief. And I might use, if I'm going to use the word mourning, all of these are often used interchangeably, but I think they're all subtly different. Mourning is the process of consciously going through bereavement, during which time grief will be to the fore. But my understanding of grief is that it is an aspect of love. It's very much part of loving and living. And that as much as we are, and this is a worldview question again, I suppose, but it depends if you think of love as transactional. It's something that we do, we give it and we receive it, that it's a give and a take. In as much as we are loving to a greater or lesser extent throughout the arc of our human life, we would then be also grieving throughout the arc of our human life, because love and grief would be directly related to each other, because love has an object. If we are loving something or someone, it has an object, and grief, the object is missing. There is a lack or a void at that we love. We've either lost it or we didn't get it, or it should be there but it's not, or we wanted it, we didn't get it. So there is an absence of the object in the transaction of love, and that creates grief. But it's grief and love are the same, two sides of the same coin in my book. But then I can say about worldview, for some people, we aren't just transactional in our love. We actually are love. And that's many religions would take up that God is love, whatever, use the word God with a pinch of salt, whatever that means to you, that we would know that as love, and we are love, and we are an extension of love. And if love is grief, then grief is what it is to be human. It's inherent in our dualistic nature to always have that lack and to love nonetheless, and to feel that as a agony against the ecstasy that in the same moment of what it is to be human and alive. So I don't paint grief as a particular thing. For me, grief is waveform, and these moments of loss throughout our life, these periods of bereavement are particular. We have the particle and the wave. And obviously, when we are experiencing a loss, then we experience more grief as a result of it, because we are really feeling an unconscious awareness of that loss. So the grief comes up. But there'll come a point in bereavement, or when your mourning period is over, when the psyche is fully adjusted to the loss. It's no longer something that we're in denial of or struggling with, or we accept it. 100% complete psychic, spiritual soul being, whole acceptance. Then the mourning period or the bereavement period is over, but the grief doesn't go away, because grief is love, and that is what it is to be alive. And there is a direct correlation between grief and consciousness. And I've used this, I may have even used this on your previous podcast. So if I'm repeating myself, forgive me. But it's a really good example. When Facebook was first getting popular years ago, decades ago now, because we're so old, decades ago when Facebook was a friend of mine had a really good friend in school and lost contact with that friend. And then Facebook comes up, and my friend says, "Oh, I would really love to find, can I find my childhood friend on Facebook?" After a little bit of investigation, they come to the realization that actually this childhood friend of theirs had died young, shockingly, a couple of years earlier. And then upon knowing that, my friend started to grieve. So it wasn't the death of the friend, the other friend, it wasn't the death of that friend that caused her to grieve. It was the consciousness. It was only in knowing that fact that she then grieved. So there is a correlation between grief and consciousness, which is really important in terms of collapse awareness, because as people become conscious and start to reckon and wrestle with that bereavement, the denial, the struggle, the psyche can't adjust, all of that, in the consciousness comes the grief. So there is a period, I think, of adjustment that people need to go through when they start to actually see through the mainstream denial, not just of systemic collapse in the ecological sphere, but in our institutions, in our social contracts. Everything is collapsing.
So,
Everything.
if I may,
Yeah.
that makes total sense to me that when people become aware of the collapse, the bad news, then they begin to grieve.
Yeah,
Or no, they begin the bereavement process and feel grief. Do I have
that's
that
right.
correct?
Yeah.
Okay.
So
Now
as it
here's
comes to consciousness, they start to notice their grief more. Yeah.
okay. Now, for me, the question is once they have investigated uh, collapse and the consequences of it for their own life, presumably there is a period equivalent to the bereavement period during which that becomes integrated into their psyche, the
Yeah.
knowledge of collapse and the effects on their life and their future that becomes integrated into their psyche, and the bereavement the bereavement ends.
Well, that's a good point, because what if that were the case, what we would be assuming is that these particular griefs, these particular losses happen sequentially and one at a time. right? So that would be a very simplistic model. And I suppose it's a helpful model to begin to understand what I'm saying about the difference between bereavement and grief, is that you have a loss, you adjust to that loss during the period of adjustment, you're mourning, you're bereaved, the grief is to the fore, and then that closes. But actually, these are little waves on an ocean of reality. So there is just loss after loss after loss after loss, realization after realization. So we are actually in choppy water in terms of the arc of that bereavement process. Is we're not getting to the end of one before the next one starts. In fact, one little wave of grief, or I see you hear me using the words interchangeably. It always makes sense to me, but a wave of mourning comes over us over a particular realization, and then that might become a bigger wave because it sucks in other little waves, and before we know it, we've got a tsunami. Or we could just be in choppy waters with a billion waves going off all at the same time, or we
So
could just drown.
the process of loss in the context of collapse, the process of loss continues.
Yes.
It's not like there's a single loss. We grieve it. We are bereaved. We adjust, and then we're through it. That's not what's happening.
No.
There's a continual choppy waters of loss, one after the other after the other. Is that what
Yeah.
you're saying?
Yes.
Yeah.
That's what I'm saying. And so I suppose in all of that, it's a good analogy to find ourselves at sea, repeatedly being slapped after wave, being buffeted from side to side. And what happens, I think, is that the human mind, and I'm not talking about everybody in general terms, but a lot of people tend to think about their personal experience of loss as being their loss. This singular experience of my loss is mine, it's personal. And then one gets invested in that moment in identity associated with that loss as part of one's own identity. And then you, in the individualization of it, it becomes very much a singular narrative. But actually, loss is systemic. Any personal loss we have is also systemic, and anything that's systemic is also personal. So there's also a compounding consciousness that's happening whereby we're witnessing our own sense of loss, but we're also becoming more and more aware of this ocean of loss that other people are in as well. And therefore, it's not just mine or yours. We are in a broader, a much deeper, wider, multidimensional sense of goodness me, what is being lost.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that zooming out of consciousness or deepening of consciousness, or that expansion of consciousness, is in itself a collapse, because it's this ability to just compartmentalize my grief, and I have dealt with my grief, and I have practices to deal with my process. It's all very individualistic. That in the zooming out and in the taking the broader view, that individual collapses as well. We can't sustain the vision of the individual in a broader awareness of collapse, because we're all in it.
So, what I think I may hear you implying is that collapse acceptance may have to do with lowering the boundaries between individuals, that connecting with others to create relationships and belonging is critical to collapse acceptance, or to coping with the constant waves of loss.
Yes. Yes. And that, for me, acceptance is not about completion, or it's all okay now, or I'm over it, or any of that. Acceptance for me is nuanced, it's subtle, and it can turn on a dime, turn on a penny. But it's about surrender in all of that. It's, for me, it's about not fighting reality And that's not to say that you don't stand up for and fight for equity and fairness and all of that when you can in your sphere. But at the same time, an inner acceptance is a dropping of the fight. It's the fist, instead of being closed, becomes open. It's an internal adjustment to say that there is just only so much that I can do. And in order for me to be effective and useful in the world, I've got to stop resisting reality. And this, I think, definitely came up in one of the previous podcasts I did with you, because that is the role of the archetypal midwife. Birth and death and any in between, any rite of passage involves pain, and that pain has purpose. The purpose of life, as I see it, is not to be pain-free, struggle-free, just cruising along. If you are in a life like that, chances are highly privileged and in a lot of denial. There is just so much pain in life, but the struggle and the suffering comes in the resistance to the process. So if we see these waves upon waves of change, loss as labors of deaths and potentially rebirths, then those waves of pressure and waves of constriction and waves of pain are contractions, and that pain, if we go through it consciously and together, has an ending to it. But if we resist it and pull against it and work against the process, that's when we create not just suffering but also harm. So there is something in the midwifery of the process which just says, yes, this is painful. You are not alone. I see you in your pain. This too shall pass. And that's, for me, what I think. I say the word doula and it doesn't mean a lot, but that's what I'm talking about, is
So
this archetypal midwifery.
you say that process of pain and contraction comes to an end. What is that end? It sounds like a birth. Birth
Yeah.
of what?
Mm. Mm. Who knows? I think the rhetorical question is, what is dying? And then what is being born in every moment? Like in literally every moment. What is dying and what is being born? Whatever feels like a death is always a birth of something, a transformation or transmutation from something to something. But that's not to deny the reality of that loss for the person who's been married for 50 years and their husband drops dead or whatever. That loss is real for them. But the transmutation, transformation has a continuum, has the waveform through it, if that makes sense. So I feel like it's rhetorical to the extent that I don't have the answers, but I think that every individual will find an answer if they ask that question of themselves. What is dying? What is being born? I have my own relationship with that. I always stop short. There's like a little catch in my willingness to flow, because actually my vision, and I don't mean like what I want to happen, but what I experience happening is so big, so cosmic, so catastrophic, and yet so exquisite that 99.9% of the human race can't handle what I might say. And I'm willing to say it, but what I don't want to happen in that is that either people glamorize what I'm saying as, oh, wow, Alexandra sees this and this is what's happening. I don't know that it's what's happening. But I also don't want, I'm very much like managing my energy as well around the kind of keyboard warrior trolley type energies that are out there that, everyone's got an opinion. And I'm like, I don't care. I don't care what your opinion is. I will have a really God honest conversation with someone who I actually think has got an open mind, is mutable and flexible, and I will meet them in the same space. But for the most part, you just reach a lot of denial, a lot of blocks in people. So I'm cautious, but there is something that I feel is happening very, very deep down, which is almost like the opposite of the Big Bang. And it's so where we came from, we're returning to. And in reality, that might take tens of thousands of years to return back, into the black hole, into the void. But if we came from the void, we return to the void, and that the cyclical nature of life, creation and destruction, the forces that would birth and then die, it's a massive turning of multiple cycles. It's as if many smaller cycles have all synced so that there's a big returning back to where we came from. And as that happens, there is the business of life in the human realm and what we can see, the mundane realm that we can touch and feel and interact with. But there is a lot going on in the unseen. And then that's got to be open to people's different worldviews and interpretations. But there's so much unresolved in the unseen realms, in the other spaces, or the in-between spaces, the grey space. There's so much unresolved in that and I don't like to use words like reckoning, because it does sound very like end of days stuff. I remember you called me the prophetess of doom. But there's this, for want of a better word, a reckoning with all that's not been resolved in the in-between, in the relational community space, which was lost to religion, enlightenment, industrialization, capitalism, colonialism. All of that took us away from our knowledge of the cyclical nature of life and death, our own indigenousness. And so that remains unresolved in the unseen. And that could look like, for some people in a particular worldview, that could look like many dead unmourned. Many of our ancestors not had proper death rites, trapped in the in-between space. You could see it that way. Or you could see it as many threads of trauma that have not been tied off and healed, all enmeshed in the grey space, or everything's all knotted up. And what's happening at this time is we're being forced to face the consequences of the lost rites, our lost rituals, our lost practices of those practices of our own indigenous nature would have always kept us in right relationship, at right size, and in right relationship with the land and the
Let
place,
me,
space and everything. And so we're
yeah,
having to grieve, we're having to mourn all that has been unmourned because of the loss of our death rites and practices and community around that. So there is so much in the unseen space that is pressing itself into our consciousness. When we turn together to face it, we're no longer resisting it. The through flow of grief, as I see it, the catharsis that will come through that consciousness, is a massive release of energy. I mean, so many people are tired, I mean, to the bone weary, exhausted, because we haven't given that, the water cycle of the flow of grief, we haven't given that its ability to flow forwards and through. So when I talk about toxic emotionality being mistaken for grief, I mean, when we're sitting in a therapist's office or sitting in our own bedroom, having a right good cry on our own, there's a kind of elliptical self-interest in that, which is stagnant in its energy. And so it's mourning together that creates the through flow that allows the flow of grief to transport us from one place to another internally. And that, for me, is happening, whether we like it or not, that's happening at a global level. And it is for the peace of our ancestors and our descendants. It is for the peace of our own souls that we need to make reparation in the unseen for the damage done by our unconsciousness, to atone, essentially, so that we can return.
very good, very good. So if I, well, I do understand you. my response is that this impacts the idea of collapse acceptance as an individual thing that an individual does. It challenges that. It's not a matter of individually going through a process and reaching a particular state of mind. It is reconnecting with a variety of things you can describe, the community of life, the unseen accumulated grief and trauma, as you've been talking about. But it's about connection and reconnection and doing it together.
Yeah. Yes. It's absolutely what I believe, rightly or wrongly. And I don't anymore really think that any state of being is individual. You know, I've often struggled against the idea, struggled to find peace with the idea of individual enlightenment, for example, right? There's no point in individuals self-realizing and calling themselves enlightened. We are as enlightened as the least enlightened person on earth, right? We either are all enlightened or we're not enlightened at all. Like there isn't a kind of star chart that you get good behavior. Oh, look, you've done your practice. You've meditated
Okay.
this long. You've done this.
Th-
You're
th-
okay.
that's bodhisattva talk. So
Right.
I want to stop here for today because
Okay, half an
we've
hour.
half
You've
an
done well
hour.
to get me into half an hour, I have to say.
We've
Known for my rambling.
we've covered a lot of ground.
Yeah.
I hope you will come back. I feel like this is the beginning of a conversation, not the
Yeah.
end.
Can I
So
just to conclude that sentence though, that
yes, sorry.
thought is that one cannot become collapse aware alone. We are either all collapse aware and in a acceptance. We can't accept on our own. We are either all accepting or we are still in a process of acceptance. And there will be some who have greater experienced it and glimpsed it greater than others. But we can't be in a period of systemic collapse and do something individually. That just doesn't compute in my mind. We are part of a system, and that system is us.
Thank you. And
There we go.
that's why this program and many other people doing many other things are intent on creating connections and relationships using whatever means are available. Even the internet will do in a pinch.
Yeah.
It's like we need to connect and make these relationships so that we can face collapse together, but much more deeply than that, as you have described. All right, that's enough for today, but I want to make arrangements with you now for a return visit.
Okay.
I'll say to our viewers and our guests, thank you for being with us today. This is Collapse Club. I am David Baum in Seattle. I've been today with Alexandra Derwen from North Wales. You will find links to her books and materials in the video description below. That's all for now. Until we meet again, farewell.